Okay, so Bernie Sanders got to dunk on Joe Biden last night because Joe Biden was questioned about his support for the Iraq War. And as you know, Bernie Sanders, he did not support the Iraq War. He led the opposition against it. So he was in one of the very rare positions out of any politician that was around at the time that can actually go after Joe Biden for his Iraq War vote and say that he did not do the same when faced with the same situation. So there was a lot of attention going to Kamala Harris for wrecking Joe Biden over everything last night. And don't get me wrong, she did wreck him, and I will be covering that as well. But I thought this was another underrated moment where Bernie Sanders really got to bury Joe Biden a little bit more. So here is that clip, and then I'll be back for more.
You have made your decades of experience in foreign policy a pillar of your campaign. But when the time came to say yes or no on one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of the last century, you voted for the Iraq War. You have since said you regret that vote. But why should voters trust your judgment when it comes to making a decision about taking the country to war the next time?
Because once Bush abused that power, what happened was we got elected after that. I made sure the president turned to me and said, Joe, get our combat troops out of Iraq. I was responsible for getting 150,000 combat troops out of Iraq, and my son was one of them. I also think we should not have combat troops in Afghanistan. It's long overdue. It should end. And thirdly, I believe that you're not going to find anybody who has pulled together more of alliances to deal with what is the real stateless threat out there. We cannot go it alone in terms of dealing with terrorism. So I'd eliminate the act that allowed us to go into war and not the AUMF, and make sure that it could only be used for what its intent was, and that is to go after terrorists, but never do it alone. That's why we have to repair our alliances. We put together 65 countries to make sure we dealt with ISIS in Iraq and other places. That's what I would do. That's what I have done, and I know how to do it.
Senator Sanders, 30 seconds.
One of the differences that Joe and I have in our record is Joe voted for that war. I helped lead the opposition to that war, which is a total disaster. Second of all, I helped lead the effort for the first time to utilize the War Powers Act to get the United States out of the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen, which is the most horrific humanitarian disaster on earth. And thirdly, let me be very clear. I will do everything I can to prevent a war with Iran, which would be far worse than disastrous war with
Senator
Iraq.
Sanders, thank you.
So I think that's great that Bernie Sanders brought that up, because it's a very important issue to the American people, and the American people view some kind of regime change war very, very negatively. So that is an issue where if you bring up Joe Biden voting for the Iraq War, which in general a majority of the American public views as an unmitigated disaster, and you say, hey, I was there, I was in the same situation as Joe Biden, I was in the same Congress, and I voted against it, and same access to information, everything, but I had the foresight to vote against this, or I wasn't greedy enough to be sold out to the military-industrial complex and vote for this war. But Joe Biden, he either didn't have the foresight to see how disastrous this would be, or he's just a warmonger, and he's corrupted by the military-industrial complex to vote for us to go to war. So either way you slice it, I came out extremely positively out of this issue, and Joe Biden, he made a mess of it, and he voted for something that later turned out to be a disaster. So do you want somebody that's uncorruptible and that will have the foresight to not get us into these wars that turn out to be a complete mess? Or do you want to vote for the guy that either didn't have the foresight or was too bought off to vote against this type of war? And how can you trust his judgment going forward with any other policy if he has shown multiple times in not just this area, but let's say in just tax cuts and Social Security, all of that. If you take all of that as a whole and you see how many times Bernie Sanders was correct on the issues and how many times that Joe Biden was not correct on the issues, then it just becomes a clear choice. And Bernie Sanders, as long as Joe Biden is a front runner, needs to follow Kamala Harris in tearing Joe Biden down. Not just Joe Biden, he has to tear apart all of those establishment Democrats that are competing against him. But he has to go after Joe Biden hard. And that was the one moment where I felt like he really did jab at Joe Biden. And I think it was a very successful jab. And to give more credit to Bernie Sanders, he was the only candidate that brought up Yemen, which is an unbelievably heartbreaking humanitarian crisis right now. There is a literal genocide being committed in Yemen by Saudi Arabia, and the United States is selling arms to Saudi Arabia, making billions of dollars off of arms sales from a country that is committing a genocide as we speak, and we stand by idly. And Bernie Sanders has been leading the charge to go after this and to stop this from happening. Him and Ro Khanna, they have had the morality to actually stand up and fight against us being allied with Saudi Arabia in this genocide. And he brought it up last night to a massive audience that was watching these Democratic debates. And there may be plenty of people that don't know the dire consequences of what is going on in Yemen right now. It doesn't get the coverage it deserves by any means from mainstream media. So some people that only watch mainstream media, that are casual Democratic voters or just independents, whatever, they're finally watching this tonight because they only watch NBC or what have you. And they see Bernie Sanders talking about Yemen. And maybe that sparks enough where they hear him say something about that, and then they go look back and Google Yemen and look into what kind of disaster is actually going on over there right now. Because it is a disgusting, disgusting genocide. And for the U.S. to have our hands dirty in this is despicable. And Donald Trump should be ashamed of himself for keeping us involved with Saudi Arabia as all of this is happening. We should be doing everything we can to not only not be allied with Saudi Arabia in this conflict, but to pressure Saudi Arabia with a global effort to stop them from committing this genocide and to stop this terrible crisis in Yemen. So major props to Bernie Sanders for bringing that up. That is part of what makes him such a great candidate, is that he is clued in on these issues that are extremely important, and whether there's stuff that's popularly known about or not, he will bring them up to bring Americans' attentions to these crises or to these gigantic problems that we have in not just American society, but global society. And it's extremely important to do so. And even if 10 to 100 new people that didn't know a lot about Yemen ended up Googling that or looking into it in any way and ended up being more informed on that type of topic and maybe flipped on maybe being neutral on it or not knowing enough about it to care, to being dedicated against an issue like us aiding Saudi Arabia in a genocide. So it's very important to do. It's very important to enlighten casual voters on these extremely dire and important issues. And that's why it's so great that Bernie Sanders did that. And the fact that he also gave us that vote of confidence that he would do everything in his power to avoid war with Iran. Obviously, that's comforting. We know that he would do that anyway, if you know Bernie Sanders at all. Because Iran, it's so much bigger than Iraq. The military is more advanced. The military is far larger. It could be a far more destabilized environment if we did take out the regime there and go to war. There are so many problems that could arise from a war in Iran, and Bernie Sanders realizes that. And it's important that he continues to punch in on that issue because it's an important issue to the American public. And it's dire for not just American lives, it's dire for innocent lives across the Middle East and the United States, that we stay out of regime change wars such as Iran. And we have to learn from our mistakes in Iraq to help enlighten us for the future. And he says, listen, I knew what was going on with Iraq. I knew that that would be a disaster, and I see the same thing coming with Iran, so you know where I stand. Even back then, before all of the negative optics about going to war, I still stood strong and said that I didn't want to go to war in Iraq. And you can have faith that I won't go to war in Iran, and I'll do everything in my power to fight against that. Joe Biden, on the other hand, no matter what he says about I'll do everything in my power to keep us out of Iran, that's great, Joe, but do you have a track record of doing stuff like that? Or do you have a track record of supporting these types of wars? So it was very important for Bernie Sanders to jab at Joe Biden on such a crucial topic to global politics as a whole. And hopefully we don't end up in Iran anytime soon before these 2020 before this 2020 election, and hopefully Bernie Sanders can get into the White House and we never have to go to war with Iran.